It started with a phone call no one ever wants to get. I was halfway through dinner when my cell buzzed on the counter. I saw the hospital's number flashing on the screen, and my heart stuttered. For a moment, I thought of the worst: blood, sirens, shattered glass. But when the voice on the other end told me that Isabel was all right, just a few cuts and bruises, I felt my breath return. They said she'd been in an accident on Ridgewood Road, just outside town, and that I should come pick her up. The drive to Hillcrest General felt like a blur. The roads were dark, winding through fields that seemed to stretch on forever. My mind raced as I thought about what could have happened. Isabel never sped. She was always careful. Maybe an animal had run into the road, or maybe it was just bad luck. It didn't matter. I just needed to get to her. When I arrived, I found Isabel sitting in the emergency room, her arm wrapped in a makeshift sling. Her clothes were dirty and torn, but she smiled when she saw me, a shaky, uncertain smile that sent a twinge of relief through my chest. I sat beside her, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "You okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She nodded, wincing as she shifted her weight. "Yeah, just sore. They said it could have been worse. I'm sorry I scared you." She looked smaller than I remembered, vulnerable in a way that felt alien to me. I squeezed her hand, letting out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. "It's all right," I said. "You're safe. That's all that matters." But later, as I helped her into the car and drove her home, I noticed the way she kept glancing out the window, as if she was expecting to see someone or something lurking in the darkness outside. It was subtle, just a flicker of her eyes every few minutes, but it put a knot of unease in my chest. I told myself she was just rattled, that the accident had left her shaken. But part of me knew better. The next morning, after Isabel went back to bed, I decided to swing by the impound lot to pick up her car. I told myself it was just a practical thing to do. There was no sense in leaving it there, racking up fees. But really, I think I just needed to see it for myself, to understand what had happened on that empty road. Her car was a wreck. The front end had crumpled like a soda can, and the passenger side window was shattered. The airbag had deployed, leaving powdery residue on the seats. But it wasn't the damage that caught my attention. It was the odd feeling that the crash didn't make sense. There was no obvious cause, no skid marks on the road where she would have tried to brake. It was like she'd just driven off the road without warning. As I reached over to grab her things from the glove compartment, my hand brushed against something tucked under the passenger seat. I pulled out a small, dusty key with a worn label that had almost rubbed off. Next to it was a crumpled slip of paper. I smoothed it out, frowning as I read the two words written in hasty, looping script: "Don't forget Tuesday." I turned the key over in my hand, feeling a strange chill work its way down my spine. It was old, the kind of key you'd use for a storage unit or a lockbox. Definitely not something from our house. In the note, it was vague enough to be nothing, but something about it felt wrong. It felt like a message meant for someone else, not for me. When I got home, Isabel was curled up on the couch, wrapped in a blanket. She looked up when I walked in, offering me a tired smile. "Find anything interesting?" she asked, her voice light, but there was a tightness in her jaw that I couldn't ignore. "Just some of your stuff from the car," I replied casually, tucking the key and note into my jacket pocket before she could see. I forced a smile. "How are you feeling?" She sighed, leaning back against the cushions. "Better, I guess. My head still hurts, but the doctor said I just need rest. Thanks for picking up the car. I know it's a mess." "It's no problem," I said, but my mind was elsewhere, replaying the moment I found the key. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something, and when she reached for my hand, her touch felt colder than it had before. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring up at the ceiling as Isabel slept beside me. Her breathing was slow and even, but I couldn't relax, my thoughts buzzing like static. I found myself thinking about all the little changes I'd noticed over the past few months. How she'd been distracted, her mind always somewhere else, the way she'd stopped talking about her days at work, claiming they were boring whenever I asked. I pulled the key from my jacket pocket, turning it over in the moonlight. It felt heavy in my hand, like it held some kind of secret. A part of me wanted to wake her up right then and there, to shove the key and the note in her face and demand answers. But another part of me, maybe the smarter part, knew that whatever this was, I needed to understand it before I confronted her. So instead, I tucked the key back into my pocket and lay there, listening to the sound of her breathing. I told myself that I was being paranoid, that maybe the note was just an old reminder from years ago, that the key didn't mean anything. But deep down, I knew that something had changed between us, even if I couldn't put a name to it yet. As I finally drifted into a restless sleep, I promised myself one thing. I would find out what this key opened, and I'd get to the bottom of whatever secret Isabel had been hiding, even if I didn't like what I found. The next few days passed in a haze of half-answered questions and gut-wrenching doubts. Isabel spent most of her time recovering, drifting between the couch and the bedroom, while I tried to act like everything was normal. But every time I saw her close her eyes, I found myself reaching for the key, feeling its cold weight in my pocket like a secret burning a hole through my resolve. Isabel seemed more distant than ever, a hollow version of herself. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just the aftermath of the accident, but the excuses she gave when she left the house started to sound rehearsed, unnatural. The vague errands, the unexplained drives around town, none of it added up. One afternoon, she told me she needed to see an old friend, but I could see the tension in her hands as she twisted her wedding ring around her finger, the way her eyes didn't quite meet mine when she kissed me goodbye. So I followed her. She didn't notice me as I trailed her through town in my old, beat-up pickup, keeping a few car lengths behind. I told myself I'd turn back if she really was just visiting a friend, but I knew better. A part of me had already decided that I wouldn't find her where she said she'd be. And I was right. She drove past the familiar rows of houses and small shops in Hillcrest, heading toward the industrial outskirts where the town faded into rusted warehouses and empty lots. I hung back, watching as she turned into a gravel driveway that led to a rundown warehouse near the train tracks. She parked behind a row of abandoned trucks, disappearing from view. I pulled over a block away, my heart pounding as I crept closer on foot, sticking to the shadows. From behind a stack of rusted barrels, I saw her step out of the car and look around, her body tense, like she was waiting for someone. That's when I saw him, a man I didn't recognize, tall with a shaved head, wearing a leather jacket that caught the late afternoon light. He emerged from a side door of the warehouse, carrying a small, black duffel bag. They spoke quietly, their words carried away by the wind, but their body language told me everything I needed to know. The way he leaned in close, the way she nodded quickly, glancing over her shoulder like she was afraid of being seen. It was more than just a casual meeting. My hands shook as I fumbled for my phone, snapping a few blurry photos of the exchange. I zoomed in, trying to get a clear shot of the man's face. He turned slightly, giving me a better angle, and that's when my stomach twisted into a knot. I knew him. His name was Officer Grant, one of the police officers in Hillcrest. I'd seen him around town, at the local diner, even at a few community events. He was well-liked, always ready with a smile or a handshake. But seeing him here with Isabel made something click into place. This wasn't just an affair. There was something else at play, something dangerous. I watched as Grant handed Isabel the duffel bag, his expression grim. She glanced inside quickly, nodding before zipping it shut. As she moved to hand him something in return, a white envelope, I caught a glimpse of what looked like a stack of money inside. My stomach lurched. They exchanged a few more words, and then she hurried back to her car, casting one last, anxious glance over her shoulder before driving away. I stayed hidden until Grant disappeared back into the warehouse, then returned to my car, feeling like my mind had been pulled in a dozen different directions. I couldn't shake the look on Isabel's face, the fear I'd seen there. Was it fear of being caught, or something worse? As I drove home, the photos I'd taken sat like a weight in my pocket. I felt a twisted sense of satisfaction at catching her in the lie, but it was buried beneath a deep, gnawing fear. What if this wasn't just about some hidden money or a secret rendezvous? What if she was involved in something far more dangerous? When I got home, Isabel was already back, standing in the kitchen with her back to me, washing dishes as if everything were perfectly normal. I watched her for a moment, trying to reconcile the woman in front of me with the one I'd seen at the warehouse. "You're back early," she said over her shoulder, not turning around. "Everything okay?" My throat tightened, but I forced a smile. "Yeah, everything's fine. Just thought I'd take a drive, clear my head. She glanced back at me then, her eyes searching my face. For a second, I thought she might have seen through the lie. But then she turned away, her shoulders relaxing as she scrubbed at a stubborn stain on a plate. "That's good," she said softly, as if the conversation was already over. "Sometimes it's nice to get away for a bit." I nodded. Even though she couldn't see me, my mind racing with the memory of the black bag and the envelope full of cash. "Yeah," I murmured. "I guess it is." That night, as she slept beside me, I looked through the photos again, zooming in on Grant's face, on the strained look in Isabel's eyes. It felt like I was staring at evidence from someone else's life, a life that had been running parallel to mine without me ever knowing. I wanted to confront her, to shove the photos in her face and demand an explanation, but I couldn't shake the memory of Grant's cold expression, the sense that this went deeper than I could handle on my own. Instead, I decided to dig further, to find out what she was hiding before I made my next move. And I'd start with the key. The next morning, after Isabel left for work, I drove to the local bank, the one where we'd opened an account together years ago. It took a bit of convincing to get the manager to let me access the safety deposit box that matched the key's number. I told him it was a family matter, that I just needed to grab a few things for Isabel while she was recovering from her accident. He bought it, eventually, though he kept glancing at the paperwork, as if wondering if he should double-check with her. When I finally slid the key into the lock and turned it, the box clicked open with a metallic thunk, revealing a stack of cash and something else that made my heart stop. A passport with Isabel's face on it. But the name on the passport wasn't hers. It read Catherine Stokes, and the photo showed her with a different haircut, one I hadn't seen in years. Beneath the passport was a small burner phone, cheap and nondescript. My hands trembled as I powered it on, scrolling through the recent messages. Most of them were from an unknown number, but one name stood out immediately: Grant. The latest message was timestamped just a few hours before their meeting. "See you Tuesday. Make sure you have the package ready. No mistakes." The words blurred in front of my eyes, my mind spinning with the realization of just how much I didn't know. Isabel wasn't just lying to me. She was living a whole other life, right under my nose. But whether she was a victim or a player in all of this, I couldn't tell. I closed the box and left the bank, the burner phone heavy in my pocket. I knew I couldn't keep pretending I didn't know. Not after this. I spent the next few days in a haze, my mind reeling with everything I'd found. Every time I looked at Isabel, the passport and the burner phone burned in the back of my mind. Her name, Catherine Stokes, looped through my thoughts like a broken record. She must have known I was starting to unravel the truth, but she kept up the same charade of normalcy. Chatting over dinner, asking about my day, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. I knew I couldn't keep playing along, but I also knew I needed to catch her off guard. So that night, when she finally went to bed, I locked myself in the garage with the burner phone, scrolling through the old messages again, looking for something I'd missed. Most of them were mundane, coded instructions between Isabel and Grant, talking about delivering packages and final arrangements. But then I found a thread that made my blood run cold. It was a message from Grant, sent a few days before the accident. "This is your last chance. Make the delivery on Tuesday, or you know what happens." Isabel's reply was short, almost pleading, "I'll do it. Just make sure it's clean." The implications settled over me like a noose tightening around my throat. Had the accident been a warning from Grant? A reminder of what would happen if she tried to back out? I felt a twisted knot of anger in my gut. Maybe this wasn't about the money at all. Maybe she was running scared, trying to buy herself a way out of a deal gone wrong. Or maybe she was willing to drag me down with her to protect her secrets. I had to know, and I needed to confront her before she could weave another lie. I waited until morning, when the sun was just starting to rise and the house was quiet. Isabel was in the kitchen, brewing coffee. She looked up when I walked in, offering me a sleepy smile. But as I pulled the passport out of my pocket and tossed it onto the table between us, her expression froze. Her hand tightened around the mug, her knuckles turning white. "Where did you get that?" she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "I found it in your safety deposit box," I replied, keeping my tone flat, even though my pulse pounded in my ears. "Right next to the burner phone?" And the money. What the hell is going on, Isabel? She stared at the passport, her face pale, like she was calculating how much I already knew. For a moment, I thought she might try to lie again, but then she let out a shaky breath and collapsed into the chair across from me, burying her face in her hands. I never wanted you to find out this way, she murmured, her voice breaking. Find out what? I pressed, leaning closer, my frustration boiling over. That you've been lying to me for God knows how long? That you've been meeting with a corrupt cop behind my back? Her head snapped up, and there was a wild, desperate look in her eyes. It's not what you think, James. I swear, I was doing it to protect you. To protect us. I let out a bitter laugh. Protect us? That's rich, Isabel. Protecting me from what, exactly? A stash of dirty money and a fake identity? She flinched at the anger in my voice. But then her expression hardened, and I saw something new in her face, a defiance that made my skin crawl. You don't understand, she shot back. Grant, he's not just some cop. He's part of a network. They use people like me to move money, to cover up transactions. They're laundering millions through fake companies, businesses that don't exist. And when I realized how deep I was in, I tried to get out. But you don't just walk away from people like Grant. Is that why you were meeting him? I asked, my voice dripping with sarcasm. To get out? Because it looked to me like you were doing business as usual. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. And when she opened them again, they were filled with a kind of desperate sincerity that almost made me doubt myself. I was trying to get something on him, evidence that would keep him off my back. That's what the package was, its files, recordings of his meetings with the other officers. If I could get enough, I thought I could use it as leverage to buy our way out. I shook my head, feeling my hands tremble as I gripped the edge of the table. And what was your plan, Isabel? To disappear with that money? To leave me behind to clean up your mess? She hesitated, and in that moment, I saw the truth in her eyes. She had been planning to leave, to vanish with a new name and a new life while I stayed behind, oblivious. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, leaving me breathless. But then she reached across the table, her hand clutching mine, her fingers cold and desperate. I was wrong, she whispered. I was going to leave, but when I saw how far you were willing to go to protect me, I couldn't do it. I'm scared, James. He's not going to let me go without a fight. Please, you have to believe me. Her touch sent a shiver through me, but I pulled my hand away, my mind spinning with 1,000 doubts. It was the way she looked at me, like she was measuring my reactions, testing how much she could tell me without giving away too much. And I realized that I couldn't tell if she was lying or if she was genuinely afraid. Before I could respond, a knock echoed through the front door, sharp and insistent. Isabel's head whipped around, her face going pale. It's him, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Grant. She jumped up, but I grabbed her arm, forcing her to face me. You said you had evidence against him. Where is it? It's hidden at the warehouse, she said quickly, her voice trembling. I can take you there, but we need to get out of here before he... But before she could finish, the door splintered open, crashing against the wall. Grant stepped inside, his expression dark, a gun leveled in his hand. Morning, folks, he said, his voice dripping with mockery. Looks like we've got a little problem to sort out. Isabel's breath caught, and she shot me a desperate look, but I couldn't move. All I could think about was the way she'd just admitted to planning her escape, how close she'd come to vanishing from my life without a trace. And in that moment, I wasn't sure if I wanted to save her or let her face the consequences of her lies. Grant stepped further into the room, his gaze shifting between the two of us, assessing. You know, Isabel, you had one job. Just one. But you couldn't even manage that, could you? He clicked his tongue, shaking his head like he was disappointed in a misbehaving child. Now I have to clean up this mess. He turned the gun on me, and for the first time, I saw real fear in Isabel's eyes. Grant, wait, she started, but he cut her off. No, I think I've waited long enough. You two had your fun, played your little game, but it ends now. Give me the files, Isabel. And maybe, just maybe, I'll let him walk away. I met Isabel's gaze, searching for any hint of truth, any reason to believe she'd been doing this to save us. But all I saw was the same desperation I'd seen before, and I knew that whatever happened next, I couldn't trust her. Not fully. The silence stretched between us, and I realized that this was the moment that would decide everything. Either I'd let her lead me deeper into her web, or I'd finally break free. The weight of the gun in Grant's hand seemed to freeze time. Isabel and I stood like statues in the kitchen, the only sound the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. His cold eyes flicked back and forth between us, the gun unwavering, as if he was just waiting for an excuse to pull the trigger. "Isabel," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You have one last chance to give me what I want. You think you can play games with me, collect a little leverage, and then just disappear? You should know better by now." Isabel's breath came in quick, shallow bursts, her hands trembling as she took a step toward him. "Grant, listen to me. It's not what you think. I have the files, okay? I just need time to get them, but you need to leave James out of this." Grant's expression twisted into a sneer. "Oh, so now you care about him? That's funny, because from what I've seen, he's just another pawn to you, isn't he?" He turned to me, and I felt the full force of his gaze, the disdain and cold calculation behind his eyes. "James, let me give you some advice. Your wife isn't who you think she is. She's been playing you for months, making you feel like you're part of this, but all she really cares about is saving her own skin. So how about you do yourself a favor, hand over what she's hiding, and walk away before this gets any uglier?" I felt a surge of anger, hot and bitter, rising in my chest. "I'm not walking away from this, Grant, and I'm not going to let you hurt her." He cocked his head to the side, studying me like I was a curious specimen. "You think you're some kind of hero, huh? That you can protect her from me? That's adorable. But here's the thing. I've already put your name in my little insurance file. A couple of fake transactions, a few carefully placed tips, and you'll be the one the cops come looking for. It'll be your prints on the money, your account they'll trace it back to." I felt my stomach drop. He was trying to scare me, but deep down, I knew he wasn't bluffing. He had the connections, the power to bury me if he wanted to. And Isabel knew it too. Her face was ashen, her eyes wide with panic as she glanced between us. For a moment, I almost believed that she was genuinely afraid for me, that she wasn't just thinking about herself. But then she said, "Grant, please, just let me go with him. We'll leave town, disappear, and you'll never hear from us again. You can keep the money, everything. I don't care anymore." Her voice broke on the last word, but Grant only laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You still think you're calling the shots, Isabel? You don't get it, do you? There's no running from this. Not for you, not for him. Now, where are the files?" I felt a spark of desperation, a wild idea that maybe, just maybe, I could turn this around. I took a step forward, forcing myself to keep my voice steady. "She doesn't have them here, Grant. But I do. You let her go, and I'll take you to them." He raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical, but there was a flicker of interest in his eyes. "Is that so? And why should I trust you?" "Because you know she'll try to double-cross you the first chance she gets," I said, the lies slipping easily from my lips. "But me? I don't have anything left to lose." For a moment, the three of us stood in a tense, fragile balance. Grant's grip on the gun tightened, and I saw the wheels turning behind his eyes, weighing his options. Then, with a sharp gesture, he nodded toward the door. "Fine, let's go. But if you try anything, she's the one who pays for it." The drive to the warehouse felt like it lasted a lifetime. Isabel sat in the back seat, her hands clenching and unclenching in her lap, while Grant kept the gun trained on me from the passenger seat. I could feel his gaze boring into the side of my head, waiting for any sign that I might try to turn the tables. But all I could think about was the final choice I'd have to make once we reached the warehouse. Whether I'd really hand him the evidence, or if I'd try to use it to force him into a corner. We pulled up to the warehouse just as the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the gravel lot. Grant marched us inside, shoving Isabel forward with a rough hand, and I led them to the room where she had stashed the files, an old storage closet filled with dusty shelves and faded cardboard boxes. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for the duffel bag I'd found earlier, my fingers brushing against the rough fabric. "Open it," Grant ordered, his gun trained on my back. I unzipped the bag slowly, revealing the stack of files inside, the recording device buried underneath. I glanced at Isabel, trying to gauge her reaction, but her face was a mask, unreadable. For a moment, I thought this might actually work, that Grant would take the files and leave, that we could somehow escape this nightmare. But as he reached for the bag, Isabel lunged, grabbing his arm and twisting it sideways. The gun went off, the sound deafening in the small space, and Grant let out a shout of pain as the bullet grazed his leg. He swung back, knocking her to the ground, but in that moment of chaos, I moved. I grabbed the gun from the floor, my hands shaking as I pointed it at him. "Get back!" I shouted, my voice cracking. "Get away from her!" Grant froze, his eyes narrowing as he sized me up. Blood seeped from the wound in his leg, but he forced a twisted smile. "You don't have the guts, James. You think you're going to shoot me? Put yourself right in the middle of this mess." His words rang in my ears, but I didn't lower the gun. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Isabel pushing herself to her feet, her face pale and determined. "James, don't," she said, her voice raw with fear. "Just let him go. We can still get out of here." I glanced at her, my chest heaving with anger and desperation. Her face was desperate, pleading, but I couldn't forget the way she'd looked at me before, the way she'd been willing to cut ties and run. I realized that no matter what happened now, I couldn't trust her, not completely. And I couldn't let Grant walk away with the upper hand. "Drop the bag," I ordered, tightening my grip on the gun. "And back away." Grant's eyes blazed with fury, but he obeyed, his hands raised as he stepped back. He was already calculating his next move. I could see it in the way his jaw clenched, in the way his gaze flicked toward the door. I knew that if I hesitated for even a second, he'd find a way to turn this around. But before I could make another move, the sound of sirens cut through the air outside the warehouse, growing louder by the second. Grant's eyes widened in surprise, and I felt a surge of panic. Had he called for backup? Or had someone else tipped off the authorities? Isabel's face crumpled as the reality set in, her hand reaching out toward me. But I took a step back, keeping the gun between us. "It's over, Isabel," I said, my voice barely audible over the sirens. "You're not going to drag me down with you." Her expression shifted to something raw, almost broken, but there was no time for any more words. The police burst through the door, guns drawn, shouting orders. I dropped the gun, raising my hands, and they swarmed in, separating us before I could even process what was happening. As they cuffed me, I caught one last glimpse of Isabel's face. Pale, tear-streaked, but with a glimmer of something I couldn't quite place. Regret? Anger? Relief? I couldn't tell, and maybe I'd never know. They questioned me for hours at the station, trying to untangle the mess of lies and half-truths. I told them everything about the files, the money, Grant's threats, but they never quite looked at me like they believed my story, and I couldn't blame them. After all, how could I explain how long I'd ignored the signs, how I'd let myself believe the lies for so long? In the end, they took my statement and let me go. But as I walked out of the station, the night air cold against my skin, I felt a hollowness settle in my chest. Grant would recover, but he'd lost his leverage, and Isabel had lost her chance to escape. She would face charges, and so would he. But that didn't feel like a victory. It felt like the end of something I couldn't put back together. After they let me go, I drove aimlessly through the streets of Hillcrest, unsure of where to go. I couldn't go home, not with the wreckage of my life lying scattered in pieces all around me. I couldn't think straight. Grant's threats, Isabel's desperate pleas, the wail of the sirens still echoing in my ears. Everything felt like it was closing in, pressing down, suffocating me. Eventually, I parked in an empty lot outside a rundown motel on the edge of town, a place where no one would look twice at a stranger staying the night. I sat there in the driver's seat, staring at the night sky through the cracked windshield, and tried to understand what had just happened. That's when my phone buzzed, dragging me back into reality. It was a message from a number I didn't recognize, but I knew who it was before I even opened it. "We need to talk. One last chance." The motel on Crescent Road. "Come alone. Isabel." The words burned on the screen, as if they carried the weight of everything we hadn't said to each other. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the delete button, but then I thought about all the questions still gnawing at me, about the files, about what had really driven her to betray me, about whether she'd ever told me the truth. So I turned the key in the ignition and drove. The motel on Crescent Road was even worse than the one I'd parked at earlier. Crumbling concrete walls, flickering neon lights, and a sagging roof that looked like it might give way any minute. Isabel was waiting outside room 12, pacing back and forth like a trapped animal, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. When she saw me, she froze, her eyes darting to the shadows as if she expected Grant to materialize out of the darkness. But then she seemed to steel herself and gestured for me to follow her inside. The room was small and dingy, the air stale with the scent of mildew and cigarette smoke. A single lamp cast a dim, yellowish glow over the threadbare carpet. She closed the door behind us, locking it with a trembling hand. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence stretching tight between us. I could see the strain on her face, the lines around her eyes that hadn't been there a year ago. But I couldn't bring myself to feel pity. "You have 5 minutes," I said, keeping my voice flat. "Why am I here?" She took a deep breath, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her jacket. "I know I've made mistakes, James, more than I can count, but I didn't want things to end like this. Not with you getting caught up in all of it." "That's rich," I said, a bitter laugh slipping out before I could stop it. "You were planning to leave me, Isabel. You were going to take the money and run." Her face twisted with something like pain, but I forced myself to keep going. "You lied to me over and over, and now you're just sorry you got caught." "It's not that simple," she snapped, her voice cracking. "You think I wanted any of this? You think I planned to end up working for Grant, hiding money, looking over my shoulder every second? He threatened me, James. He knew things about my past, about what I'd done. I thought if I played along, I could keep him from turning on me." She reached in her bag, pulling out the burner phone and the files she'd stashed away. "This is everything I have on him. The recordings, the deals, everything. But it's not enough. He'll find a way to worm out of it if it goes public. The only way we survive this is if we use it to cut a deal, to disappear." I looked down at the files, my mind racing with everything she was saying. Part of me wanted to believe her, to see the desperate woman standing in front of me as the same person I'd once loved. But the other part, the part that had been betrayed and lied to, kept me rooted in reality. "And what makes you think I'll go along with that? What makes you think I'd trust you again?" Her eyes met mine, and for a moment, I saw a flash of something I hadn't seen in months. Genuine fear, maybe even regret. "Because I don't want you to get hurt, James. I never wanted that. But you have to understand, Grant won't stop. Not until he's buried both of us." We didn't have time to say anything else. A car pulled up outside, its headlights cutting through the thin curtains, and I felt my pulse spike. Isabel tensed, glancing out the window, then back at me. "It's him," she whispered. "He must have followed you." I grabbed the files, shoving them into my jacket, and turned toward the back window. "There's a fire escape outside. We can't." The door burst open before I could finish, the lock splintering as Grant barreled inside, his gun raised. He looked like a man on the edge, his hair disheveled, a smear of dried blood staining his collar from the earlier fight. His eyes zeroed in on the files clutched in my hand, and a savage grin spread across his face. "Going somewhere?" he sneered, his gaze darting between Isabel and me. "Hand them over, or I swear I'll—" He never finished the sentence. Isabel moved faster than I'd thought possible, lunging forward and slamming her shoulder into his chest. The gun went off, a deafening crack that echoed through the tiny room, and they both crashed to the floor, grappling for control. I didn't think, I just acted. I grabbed the lamp from the nightstand and swung it down as hard as I could. It connected with the side of Grant's head, the sound dull and sickening. He crumpled, the gun slipping from his grip. Isabel staggered back, clutching her side where the bullet had grazed her. She was breathing hard, her face pale, but her eyes were fierce, determined. "Take the files," she gasped. "Get out of here, James. It's the only way." "No," I said, my voice hoarse. "Not without you." But she shook her head, pushing me toward the door. "It's too late for me. If you stay, you're just throwing your life away. Go before he wakes up." I hesitated, my mind a whirlwind of anger, grief, and the remnants of whatever feelings I still had for her. But the sound of sirens in the distance made the choice for me. I turned, running out the back of the motel and into the shadows, clutching the files to my chest like they were my last lifeline. I drove out of Hillcrest that night, never looking back, the duffel bag and files in the passenger seat. I crossed state lines by morning, trading my old car for a beat-up sedan at a roadside dealership. I used cash, the money I'd found in the safety deposit box, burning through the last ties I had to my old life. I knew it wasn't over. Grant wouldn't stay down for long, and Isabel's fate, whatever it might be, would eventually catch up to me. But for now, I had the evidence, the recordings, and a chance to decide what to do next. I could use the files to strike a deal, or I could vanish completely, leaving behind the wreckage of everything Isabel and I had built together. But as I settled into the uncomfortable seat of the new car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd left a part of myself behind in that motel room, a part that I'd never get back. And I couldn't forget the last look in Isabel's eyes. Whether it was love or regret or just desperation, I'd never know. The burner phone buzzed in the glove box, and I reached for it, expecting some last message from Isabel. But it was a new number, a message that read, "We know what you took. This isn't over." I crushed the phone in my hand, hurling it out the window as the sun rose behind me. The road stretched out ahead, empty and uncertain, and I drove into the dawn, wondering if I'd ever truly escape. The road stretched out in front of me, a thin ribbon cutting through the endless fields and dark forests. The files and recordings sat in the passenger seat like a weight pressing against my conscience. For the first time in days, I had a sliver of hope, something tangible I could use to negotiate with. But I also knew that everything I had taken was a dangerous weapon, and anyone with a stake in keeping those secrets buried would come after me. I pulled over at a rest stop just past the state line, parking behind a row of semi-trucks. The sun had just begun to rise, casting pale orange light over the deserted picnic tables and vending machines. I stared out at the empty lot, trying to piece together my next move. My mind kept drifting back to Isabel, back to the sound of the gunshot and the sight of her clutching her side, forcing me to leave her behind. The last image of her haunted me, the desperation in her eyes, the way she pushed me toward the door, like she knew she couldn't escape her fate. I shook the thoughts away, trying to focus. I needed a plan. The files contained names, dates, bank accounts, everything that could tie Grant and his associates to their money laundering schemes. If I played it right, I could turn them over to the authorities, cut a deal to protect myself. But deep down, I knew that it wouldn't be that simple. Grant's reach went deeper than I could see, and the police in Hillcrest had a habit of turning a blind eye when it suited them. As I stared down at the burner phone I had crushed earlier, I felt a pang of regret. It wasn't just because of the message, the one that said, "We know what you took." It was because, for a moment, I had hoped that Isabel might reach out to me one last time. But that hope was gone now, shattered like the phone in my hand. By midday, I reached a town called Barton's Hollow, an unassuming place with a gas station, a diner, and a small, rundown motel with a flickering vacancy sign. I paid for a room with cash, keeping my head down as I walked through the lobby. The manager barely looked at me, just slid the key across the counter before returning to his crossword puzzle. The room was a mirror image of the one I'd left behind. Stale air, peeling wallpaper, and a sagging mattress that creaked under my weight. I spread the files out across the bed, scanning through the pages, trying to make sense of it all. Every name, every transaction was a thread that tied Isabel to the world she'd tried to leave behind. One name stood out, Marco Lasker. He was one of the men Grant had mentioned in the recordings, a middleman who ran fronts for the money laundering operation. His name appeared in almost every document, always in connection with shell companies and wire transfers. I realized that if I could track him down, he might be my best shot at turning this whole thing around, either as a witness or as someone I could bargain with. But as I stared at the files, exhaustion finally caught up with me. I lay back on the bed, the paper crinkling beneath me, and drifted into a fitful sleep. I woke to the sound of tires crunching on gravel outside. My heart lurched into my throat, and I rolled off the bed, peering out through the gap in the curtains. A black SUV idled in the parking lot, its windows tinted, the engine rumbling like a predator waiting for its prey. Two men stepped out, dressed in dark jackets, their expressions cold and purposeful. I recognized the look. They were professionals, the kind of men who didn't ask questions before pulling the trigger. They moved toward the motel's front office, their gazes sweeping over the cars parked outside, searching for something. Or someone. I stuffed the files back into my bag, my mind racing. They must have traced the phone somehow, or maybe Grant had managed to send someone after me before the police took him in. Either way, it meant I was out of time. I grabbed the duffel bag and slipped out the back window, my feet crunching on the loose gravel as I darted behind the row of parked cars. The men were still inside the office, talking to the manager, and I took the chance to sprint across the lot to the edge of the woods that lined the property. My heart pounded in my chest as I plunged into the trees, the branches clawing at my face and hands. Behind me, I heard the muffled sound of voices and the slamming of car doors. But I kept running, forcing myself deeper into the woods, hoping that I could lose them in the underbrush. My legs burned, every breath tearing through my lungs like fire. But I pushed forward, driven by the thought of what they'd do to me if they caught up. I didn't stop until the sounds of pursuit faded into the distance, until the only noise was the rustling of leaves and the distant rush of a stream. I collapsed against a fallen tree, my chest heaving, the bag digging into my side. I forced myself to open the bag again, scanning through the files for any last clue, any detail that might help me get out of this alive. That's when I found it, a handwritten note, hidden among the bank records. It was written in Isabel's handwriting, her penmanship looping and precise, the ink smudged like she'd been in a hurry. James, if you find this, it means you made it out. Don't come back for me. Take the files to Barton's Hollow, the old train depot. Ask for Marco. He's expecting you. He knows what to do. The note felt like a knife twisting in my chest. I wanted to believe that she'd left it for me out of some lingering sense of loyalty, but part of me couldn't ignore the nagging suspicion that she'd known exactly how this would play out. That she'd set me up to be her last bargaining chip, her way of keeping Grant's men off her trail. But it didn't matter anymore. All I had was the name and the location, a faint thread of hope that maybe, just maybe, I could end this on my terms. I made my way to the train depot under the cover of darkness, keeping to the shadows as I approached the old, abandoned building. The air was thick with the scent of rust and decay, the tracks overgrown with weeds. I clutched the files to my chest, my every step feeling like it might be my last. A figure emerged from the shadows near the entrance, tall, broad-shouldered, with a sharp gaze that took in everything. He looked me up and down, his face expressionless. "You, James?" I nodded, my throat dry. "You're Marco." He didn't answer right away, just held out his hand. "Let's see what you've got." I hesitated, then handed him the files. He flipped through them, his expression unreadable. For a moment, I thought he might turn on me, but then he nodded, tucking the papers into his jacket. "You've got guts, showing up here alone. Most people would have taken the money and run." "I don't want the money," I said, my voice shaking with exhaustion and anger. "I just want to make sure this ends." Marco gave a low chuckle, the sound rough and humorless. "You think this is over? It's just getting started. But maybe you've bought yourself a little time. I'll make sure these reach the right people. But don't think for a second that you're safe." He turned to leave, but paused at the door, glancing back at me. "And one more thing, your wife? She's smarter than you give her credit for. She knew how to play the game. Pity she never told you the rules." I watched him disappear into the shadows, my hands clenched into fists. The anger burned hot inside me, but there was nothing left to do but leave. I drove away from Barton's Hollow that night, the road stretching out before me like a question without an answer. The files, the secrets, the danger. They were all behind me now, but the uncertainty lingered like a shadow I couldn't shake. I knew I could never go back to Hillcrest. I'd disappear, start over somewhere far from here, far from the wreckage Isabel and I had left behind. But as I drove into the dark, I couldn't help but wonder if she was still out there, running her own game, using whatever card she had left to buy herself another chance. And maybe that was the hardest truth of all, that even after everything, some part of me still wanted to believe she'd done it all for us, that she'd cared enough to give me a chance to survive. But the road stretched on, and I drove into the unknown, leaving her memory behind.